The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish...
At 78, Benny Andersson finally sits with the kind of honesty he once ran from. For decades, the world believed ABBA's story was paved with glitter, rhythm, and polished pop perfection. But behind the dazzling lights and stadium cheers lived a quieter, heavier truth, one shaped by pain, escape, and emotions Benny never learned to share out loud. When he speaks now, his voice carries the weight of years spent hiding behind melodies, letting the music say what his heart couldn't. He admits that fame never fed him the way people assumed. Awards didn't feel like accomplishments, applause didn't feel like recognition, and success didn't feel like love. What truly shaped the global phenomenon of ABBA wasn't glamour, but a series of personal storms he kept locked inside. People heard the songs, he says softly, but they didn't hear the reason behind them. Those reasons, the insecurities, the emotional distance, the silent pressure, became the invisible architecture of ABBA's sound. For the first time, Benny opens up about how he built music not just with creativity, but with wounds he didn't know how to heal. He reveals how he had fear inside harmonies, guilt inside chord progressions, and loneliness inside melodies that millions danced to without ever realizing the sorrow stitched beneath them. His truth transforms everything we thought we knew about ABBA. This isn't a story about fame. It's a story about the man who carried its weight in silence. And as he revisits his past, he uncovers not just the music that shaped the world, but the emotions that shaped him. Before ABBA turned into a global machine of hits and shimmering performances, Benny Andersson was simply a boy captivated by sound, not stardom. Growing up in Sweden, he lived in a world soaked in folk traditions, classical influences, and the warm hum of the accordion. His father and grandfather played music casually, filling the house with melodies that carried comfort, discipline, and emotion. Benny listened more than he spoke, absorbing the language of sound before he ever understood the language of people. He discovered early on that music had rules and freedom at the same time. The structure of classical compositions taught him form and discipline. The simplicity of folk taught him storytelling. Church harmonies taught him emotional weight. These layers fused into a silent map he followed his entire life. While other children dreamed of football or adventure, Benny dreamed of a perfect chord, a sound that could hold everything he felt but couldn't explain. By his teenage years, he had started playing in bands, testing sounds, experimenting with styles, and slowly realizing that he wasn't drawn to being the star. He was drawn to building the world around the star. Producing, arranging, structuring, these became his strengths long before he knew the impact they would have on pop culture. His early life didn't have glamour or drama. It had curiosity. He didn't chase attention, he chased emotion. Little did he know that this quiet obsession would eventually redefine pop music. Benny wasn't born to follow trends. He was born to build timelessness. And every influence from his childhood, every chorus, every folk rhythm, every haunting harmony, became the foundation of ABBA's future sound. A sound the world would dance to, without realizing it carried the echoes of a boy who learned to speak through music long before he learned to speak through words. When Benny met Bjorn Ulvaeus, it was less like a musical collaboration and more like fate aligning two complementary forces. Benny approached music like a sculptor, shaping textures, building emotional tension, designing soundscapes that quietly carried depth. Bjorn approached music like a storyteller, crafting lyrics, building narrative, giving voice to emotions Benny preferred to hide. Together, they formed a balance most artists never find. Their process wasn't glamorous. It was hours of trial, error, silence, and intuition. Benny would sit with the piano, chasing a feeling instead of a tune. A single chord could take hours to finalize, not because he wanted perfection, but because he wanted honesty. Every harmony needed to align with something emotional inside him. If it didn't feel right, it didn't stay, no matter how good it sounded to others. Bjorn would watch him work with a patience born from understanding that Benny wasn't crafting music, he was excavating it. Their partnership functioned like an emotional engine. Benny built the heartbeats, Bjorn wrote the words they pulsed through. This creative alliance became the backbone of ABBA's legendary catalog. Songs that appeared simple were actually intricate emotional structures. A bright melody hid loneliness. A joyful chorus carried heartbreak. A catchy hook masked vulnerability. That was Benny's genius, the ability to hide emotional storms inside glittering pop. In the studio, he became relentless. Musicians, producers, and engineers all recall the same thing: Benny replaying a section for hours, changing a single note, shifting a harmony by a hair, searching for a feeling only he could sense. He wasn't chasing trends. He was chasing truth. His work ethic bordered on obsession, but it created songs that still feel alive, still breathe, still move people decades later. He sculpted sound the way others sculpt memory, with precision and emotional weight. And while Bjorn gave the songs their stories, Benny gave them their souls. Without him, ABBA might have been catchy. With him, ABBA became unforgettable. While Agnetha and Frida lit up stages with their presence, voices, and charismatic glow, Benny remained in the shadows, by choice, yet not without consequence. Fans screamed for the women, photographers chased them, magazines praised their beauty and charisma. Meanwhile, Benny watched from behind the mixing boards, often feeling like the world saw only the surface of ABBA, not the architect who built the sound underneath. He once confessed he never felt seen in ABBA, not as an artist and certainly not as a human being. People admired the singers, but few understood the emotional weight he carried behind the scenes. Every harmony, every string arrangement, every echo and layer, it rested on him. Yet the spotlight never touched him. This created a quiet ache he rarely acknowledged. The world celebrated ABBA's image, but Benny lived in the technical trenches, turning personal emotions into pop masterpieces while the public labeled him detached or mechanical. They saw him as the brain, not the heart. They saw calculations where there were actually confessions. Worse yet, he was often the emotional mediator of the group. When tensions rose, when relationships strained, when exhaustion cracked the stability of the band, Benny stepped in to soothe, fix, or balance the dynamic. He became the silent glue holding ABBA together. But glue breaks too, it just breaks invisibly. This unspoken responsibility weighed heavily on him. The world thought he was calm. In truth, he was carrying pressure that slowly hollowed him out. As the women dazzled the public, Benny stood behind the curtain, feeling simultaneously essential and invisible. He didn't resent the women, he resented the blindness of fame, the way it overlooks the quiet ones, the ones who build the world the spotlight shines on. Benny didn't want applause. He wanted acknowledgement. And for years, he quietly suffered from the absence of it. Most listeners never noticed the emotional architecture hiding beneath ABBA's upbeat melodies. They danced, they sang along, they celebrated, never realizing that Benny was weaving sadness beneath the shine. His chord progressions carried shadows even in the brightest songs, layering melancholy under joy the same way life layers pain under laughter. This contrast became ABBA's signature. Songs like Dancing Queen felt euphoric, yet the harmonies carried longing. Knowing Me, Knowing You felt dramatic, yet its structure held quiet resignation. Benny mastered the emotional duality of pop, the ability to make people feel two things at once. And that duality came from his own emotional contradictions. He also pushed boundaries in studio production. While other bands relied on traditional recordings, Benny experimented with synthesizers, multi-track layering, and innovative mixing techniques that were ahead of their time. He built soundscapes instead of songs, treating each track like a miniature film soundtrack. He knew when to add, but more importantly, when to subtract. Silence became part of his music, a breath, a space, a pause that carried meaning. This restraint added humanity to ABBA's sound, making the songs feel alive rather than manufactured. Benny wasn't showing off. He was creating emotional trust with the listener. He arranged music the way people process life, not in straight lines, but in layers, contradictions, memories, and moments of quiet reflection. His sound wasn't just catchy. It was cinematic. This depth is why ABBA's music still resonates today. Beneath the colorful outfits and glittering stages lies a complexity only Benny could build, one that continues to echo long after the final note fades. In a recent reflection, Benny admitted something that reframes ABBA entirely: music was his emotional hiding place. While others confronted their feelings directly, Benny retreated into melodies. He was emotionally available in the studio, pouring raw feeling into compositions, but outside the booth he shut down. It became easier to write a painful chord sequence than to have a painful conversation. This confession exposes a new layer of ABBA's music, that many of the saddest, most beautiful songs were actually Benny's way of avoiding reality. The piano became his therapist, the studio his refuge, the music his shield. He wasn't avoiding the people around him. He was avoiding the vulnerability they required. This emotional pattern shaped more than just ABBA's sound. It shaped the relationships within the group, especially with Frida. While she wore her heart openly, Benny processed everything internally. What felt like calmness to the public was actually suppression. He now understands how this emotional absence created distance. Songs like The Winner Takes It All or One of Us weren't just reflections of breakups, they were musical substitutes for conversations Benny couldn't have. He expressed remorse, guilt, fear, and regret through melodies instead of words. And while the world praised ABBA's emotional authenticity, Benny lived with the guilt of knowing he expressed feelings through music rather than offering them to the people who needed them. His emotional fluency existed only in composition, never in conversation. This truth changes how we understand ABBA. The perfection of the music was built on emotional imperfection. The man who created the sound that comforted millions struggled to comfort the people closest to him. For decades, tabloids obsessed over the idea of rivalry between Agnetha and Frida. But Benny reveals that the real unspoken rivalry had nothing to do with them, it was his internal battle with fame and perception. While the women drew cameras, Benny's contributions were reduced to technical footnotes. ABBA was marketed around beauty, charisma, and vocal power. The men were labeled the brains, a phrase that stripped their contributions of emotion. Benny hated the implication that he was cold or calculated. Behind every song was emotion, not engineering. What hurt him wasn't that the women received attention. He admired them deeply. What hurt was that the world saw him as replaceable when he was the one building the architecture of ABBA's sound. Awards praised ABBA's image. Magazines celebrated the singers. Interviews focused on the glamour. Meanwhile, Benny waited for a critic, just one, to acknowledge his emotional intent, his risk-taking, his depth. Few ever did. He wasn't jealous. He was tired of the public misunderstanding what mattered most to him, the soul of the music. Over time, he accepted this invisibility. But the frustration lingered. He stopped trying to correct the narrative and instead poured everything into projects where he controlled the story: musicals, orchestral works, film scores. Only there did he feel truly seen. The real rivalry wasn't between people. It was between Benny and the world's perception. A perception that never understood the emotional sacrifices behind ABBA's shine. By the late 70s, ABBA seemed unstoppable. Hit after hit, world tours, global fame, everything looked perfect. But beneath the surface, the group was quietly falling apart. Not through drama, but through exhaustion. The relentless cycle of touring, recording, promoting, and performing drained everyone, but especially Benny. He recalls that ABBA's decline wasn't marked by a single moment of conflict. It was slow erosion, a gradual fading of excitement, chemistry, and purpose. He started feeling disconnected from the music. It no longer felt honest. The spark that once guided him to the piano each morning was gone. While the world still danced to their songs, the group privately struggled to stay emotionally and creatively aligned. Relationships cracked, communication dwindled, and the pressure of perfection suffocated their authenticity. Benny admits he stayed longer than he wanted to, not out of passion, but out of guilt. He felt responsible for the group's success, responsible for the sound, responsible for holding everything together. But staying without passion created an emotional paralysis. The end of ABBA arrived quietly. There were no arguments, no dramatic meetings, no explosive finale. Just silence, the kind that settles in when something has run its course. The band never properly discussed their breakup. They drifted apart, emotionally detached long before the world realized it was over. Frida emotionally detached earlier than Benny. She moved on, found new paths, processed the end with clarity. Benny, however, carried the weight longer. For almost a decade, he didn't truly accept that ABBA had ended. He felt lost without the routine, the purpose, and the unspoken emotional outlet music had provided. This wasn't the kind of ending fans could imagine. They expected scandal or heartbreak. But the truth was quieter, a slow creative death. Burnout consumed their passion. Expectations overshadowed joy. Fame drained their emotional energy. ABBA didn't break apart through conflict. They dissolved through exhaustion, the kind that accumulates quietly until there's nothing left to give. Benny now sees that they didn't leave the music. The music left them. And when the music stopped feeling real, everything else stopped with it. After ABBA's silent end, Benny didn't chase a solo spotlight. Instead, he disappeared into a world where music no longer demanded fame. He turned to theater, orchestral projects, and film scoring, spaces where he could create without the weight of global expectations. This period became his emotional recovery. He wasn't running away from ABBA. He was running toward himself. The music he created for Chess and Christina Fran de Vemela allowed him to explore emotions he avoided during ABBA's peak. These projects weren't products. They were therapy. During the 90s, Benny kept journals filled with unsent letters to Agnetha, Frida, and Bjorn. The letters expressed everything he never dared to say when ABBA was at its height: guilt, confusion, gratitude, regret. He wrote because he finally understood that music alone wasn't enough to process the past. As he aged, Benny found new strength in mentorship. Young Scandinavian composers sought his wisdom, and he offered them not just musical guidance, but emotional honesty, something he wished he had learned earlier. Through teaching, he healed parts of himself that remained untouched for years. Today, Benny stands as a figure of artistic integrity. He writes without pressure, without fear, without the need to prove anything. Fame no longer defines him. Emotion does. Looking back at 78, Benny finally understands the emotional journey hidden beneath ABBA's fame. He sees now that he didn't just compose music, he composed survival. His melodies held every feeling he buried, every truth he avoided, every silence he chose over confrontation. He doesn't regret the success, but he regrets the moments he wasn't present, the conversations he didn't have, the vulnerability he replaced with chords. Yet he also acknowledges the beauty that came from it, music that touched millions, music that still lives long after the stage lights dimmed. Today, Benny feels freer than ever. He creates without fear, without deadlines, without expectation. He lives quietly, knowing the world finally understands the depth he carried all along. His story isn't about fame. It's about a man who learned, far too late, that silence can hurt as much as a broken note, and that sometimes, the most powerful music comes from finally telling the truth. As Benny stepped into his later years, memory became both a comfort and a burden. He often found himself revisiting old studios in his mind, the cigarette smoke, the tangle of chords on the floor, the soft glow of the control room that felt more like home than any house he ever lived in. These memories were bittersweet, filled with triumph and loss at the same time. He admits that some memories haunt him, the nights he pushed too hard, the moments he dismissed emotional conversations because he didn't know how to participate in them, the times he expected the music to fix everything when words were needed. With age, he learned that silence wasn't wisdom, it was fear disguised as restraint. But he also carries memories that warm him, the first time he heard Agnetha and Frida harmonize together, the electrifying moment he and Bjorn realized they had created a new sound, the nights when the music felt like magic instead of pressure. These fragments of joy and sorrow shaped the mosaic of his past. Memory, to Benny, is no longer something to escape from. It is something to honor, even when it hurts. Unlike many artists who cling to fame out of fear of being forgotten, Benny welcomed the quiet. He embraced anonymity with a gentleness that shocked those around him. No entourage, no extravagant lifestyle, no desperate attempts to stay relevant. He lived simply, composing, walking, reading, cooking, and spending time with family. He found peace in ordinary routines, the solitude of early mornings, the comfort of brewing coffee, the warmth of sunlight on the piano keys in his living room. Fame had demanded constant noise. Now he cherished silence. This shift wasn't an escape. It was an evolution. He no longer needed the world's approval to feel complete. For the first time, his self-worth wasn't tied to charts or reviews. He lived not as Benny from ABBA, but as a man who had finally learned to exist outside the expectations of others. When ABBA reunited decades later, fans saw nostalgia. But for Benny, the reunion was something deeper, a quiet form of healing. It allowed him to reconnect with people he once loved but had drifted away from emotionally. This time, there was no pressure, no urgency, no hidden wounds driving the music. He described the reunion as a circle closing. No one needed to prove anything. No one needed to fix the past. They simply created older, softer, wiser. Recording together again allowed Benny to feel something he didn't experience in the 70s, gratitude. He appreciated Bjorn's lyrical genius, Agnetha's emotional sensitivity, and Frida's resilience in a way he never fully acknowledged during their youth. The reunion wasn't about fame. It was about forgiveness, of each other, and of themselves. Today, Benny understands his place in musical history in a way he couldn't before. He sees children discovering ABBA for the first time, teenagers analyzing chord progressions on social media, orchestras performing his compositions with reverence. His music has outlived him, something he never expected, but deeply cherishes. He realizes now that he didn't need the spotlight because the music itself became immortal. The melodies he once created to hide his emotions became the very thing that connected millions of people across generations. His work is studied, celebrated, dissected, and adored. For Benny, legacy is not about fame. It's about impact. And he finally accepts that his emotional language, his music, has spoken louder and longer than any words he avoided in life. In the end, Benny's story isn't tragic. It's human. He spent a lifetime speaking through music because he didn't know how to speak through emotion. He built masterpieces while hiding pieces of himself. But with time, he found balance, a way to be both a composer and a person, an architect of sound and a man with feelings he no longer needs to bury. Now, when he sits at the piano, he doesn't play to escape. He plays to connect. To remember. To breathe. His greatest realization is simple: the world loved him long before he learned to love himself. And in accepting this, Benny Andersson finally finds harmony, not in music, but in life. After decades of global fame, Benny found himself surrounded by something unfamiliar: silence. No producers calling. No press waiting. No flights, no deadlines, no crowds chanting his name. At first, the silence felt unsettling, like the world had suddenly stopped spinning. But as days turned into months, Benny realized the silence wasn't empty. It was healing. For the first time, he could hear his own thoughts. Not the rushed ones shaped by schedules, but the deeper ones he had ignored for years. Thoughts about who he was without ABBA. Thoughts about the relationships he had lost and the emotions he had buried. He discovered that silence had its own rhythm, slow, steady, grounding. It became a rare companion that didn't demand anything from him. It was the opposite of fame. It was freedom. People assumed Benny lived confidently, supported by success after success. But the truth he never admitted in his youth was that self-doubt followed him like a shadow. Every song he composed sparked the same fear: what if this is the last good one? Decades of hits didn't erase this insecurity, they intensified it. Expectations grew heavier. Fans wanted perfection. Critics waited for mistakes. And Benny, despite his genius, questioned himself constantly. Even in his late 70s, he admits he still wrestles with the silent pressure to create something meaningful. But age taught him something youth never could: perfection isn't immortal. Emotion is. That shift allowed him to compose without fear. To follow intuition instead of expectation. To choose honesty over flawlessness. As years passed, young musicians began seeking Benny's guidance, not because he was a legend, but because he understood the emotional cost of artistry. His studio became a sanctuary where new composers learned not only technique, but truth. Benny taught them that music is more than talent. It is vulnerability. It is risk. It is the courage to feel deeply and share it without fear of judgment. He warned them about the trap of fame. Fame feeds your ego, not your soul. Mentoring became a way for Benny to rewrite his own past, to give others the emotional support he never had during ABBA's peak. Through helping them, he helped himself. Regret is something Benny avoided acknowledging for years. But with age, he began confronting the quiet remorse hidden beneath his accomplishments. He regretted the conversations he never had with Frida. He regretted the emotional distance he placed between himself and Agnetha. He regretted not expressing appreciation for Bjorn during their golden years. He regretted assuming music could replace vulnerability. These regrets no longer torment him, they teach him. They remind him that emotional honesty matters more than artistic brilliance. That relationships require presence, not perfection. That music can express pain, but it cannot heal what is left unspoken. For Benny, regret became a teacher, one he finally felt ready to learn from. Decades have passed, yet ABBA feels as fresh as ever. Young fans dance to their songs as if they were released yesterday. Older fans hold their melodies like memories. And musicians study the arrangements with awe. Benny finally understands why ABBA's music doesn't belong to a time. It belongs to emotion. The layered sadness, the hopeful melodies, the cinematic harmonies, they speak to something universal. ABBA wasn't just a band. It was a feeling. And Benny, unknowingly, shaped that feeling with every unresolved emotion he poured into the music. Today, he listens to old songs not as a creator, but as a witness. He hears the boy he once was, the man he became, and the artist the world remembers. ABBA is no longer just history. It is legacy. For Benny, music has always been more than notes and rhythms. It is a language, a mirror reflecting the deepest parts of the soul. He realized that every chord he composed, every harmony he layered, was a conversation he couldn't have with words. Music became a translator for emotions too complex, too fragile, or too painful to speak aloud. He describes this as both a gift and a burden. Through music, he could connect with millions, yet remain distant from the people he loved most. The piano, the synthesizer, the studio, they became confidants, silent friends that understood him when the world could not. Even decades later, Benny listens to his own compositions and feels something that words cannot capture. Joy, sorrow, longing, hope, all exist simultaneously in a single note or pause. He learned to embrace silence as part of the song, to let the spaces between the notes carry as much meaning as the melody itself. In this way, Benny's music is eternal. It doesn't just tell a story, it invites each listener to feel, reflect, and inhabit their own emotions. And perhaps that is the ultimate triumph. Through the music that once shielded him, Benny Andersson found a way to speak to the world without ever having to speak at all.